Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Hey everybody, it's Ron Peck, Chief Legal Author of the FIA Group. Yes, the FIA Group, here with another Empowering Plans podcast. And, I already mentioned I'm here. You know who else is here? Pat the Man Santos. Pat, I can't see you, nor can I hear you, but I can sense you because we're all recording from home. There's been another surge in COVID. We're playing it safe. Obviously, we want all of our FIA Group team members to be up and running 24/7 to deal with our clients' questions, concerns, and needs. So we're recording from our various home locations. And the fact that everything was set up so nicely when I dialed in just tells me that Pat is there. And also with me, as always, is Brady Bizzarro. Hey, Brady. Wait, what do you... I'm getting a message here. Brady is not on this podcast. Micah, what are you doing here? I don't think... Have we ever done a podcast together?
No, we have not. Thank you so much for that warm intro.
Warm intro, please. Listen, what's funny is people who listen to these social media, they base their entire opinion on who we are and what we do on social media. They literally think we're a company of like 5 people and that Pat Santos is the CFO of the company. So Micah is actually a member of our consulting team. He has the pleasure of working as a health benefit plan consulting attorney. Long title, with Jen McCormick and Brady and Andrew Silverio and John Jablon and the consulting team. And Mike, I got to say, you have the pleasure of working with the team. That's always, on the minds and in the hearts and spirits of all of our clients and listeners. Everybody agrees consulting is where it's at. I sometimes feel bad for subrogation. That still makes up more than half of the company. We have attorneys, we have people in subrogation. They work day and night. They got a passion for subro, as we used to say. But I feel like we haven't done any subrogation podcasts in a long time. It's a little sad, but we're going to change that today, right? Because we're going to do a podcast today about subrogation. Isn't that right?
I mean, you might need someone else, but we can always switch it.
Come on. We're not talking about subrogation. We don't want anybody to turn this off. We're going to talk about something that's actually interesting today. So today,
no shade to subrogation, right?
Yeah, right. Don't let them know that I said this. This is recording, isn't it? Oh,
yeah, it's only public.
Oh, yeah. Well, we'll see if any of them tune in. I think the only people downloading this are my mom and my wife, and of course, everybody else. Listen, today we're going to talk about something that's actually really important. It's something that has been brewing and kind of popped up and then faded out, for some time now. And that's value-based care. It's sort of everything that comes under sort of the value-based care umbrella. And depending on who you're talking to, value-based care could include things like reference-based pricing. It can include, pretty much anything where you're not doing sort of a traditional network approach. Of course, some of the purists will say, a value-based approach really has to focus more on sort of a compensation for results rather than compensation for services. Some people will say really it has to be sort of a capitated fee model. ACOs are one example that popped to mind. And Mike, I know that this is something about which you're interested. This is a topic that you brought up to me. It is definitely something that is sort of underpinning or a foundation of a lot of the questions and things that come to our consulting team. And it always seems to be sort of this hot topic underlying everything we do, which is that, we're dealing with the high cost of care. We're dealing with these excessive charges. We're dealing with disputes over the bills. And somebody always puts their hands in the air and says, why can't we just change it? Why can't we just do it a different way? And there's always somebody, some brainiac out there like you who says, oh, well, we can do it a different way, right? And this is the example. But then there's always pushback. And I know you're going to talk a little bit about that as well.
Always pushback.
I don't know if you want to sort of, before we get into some of the details of value-based care and specifically how we're seeing it impact our clients in the industry today, if you want to give a little sort of background as far as why this is something you're interested in, why this was a subject that you proposed as a topic of conversation for the podcast today, and why do you care?
That is a good question on why do I care? I care because, I mean, kind of like you said, it's been around for years and it's this major topic that is basically a consistent throughout every issue since the ACA passed. In fact, the ACA actually included a lot of value-based care reforms itself, and it kind of represented this scattershot approach to lowering healthcare costs. And there's a famous quote from a healthcare economist that, I'm not going to bore you with the details here, but basically, like, his entire career came down to the phrase, it's the price is stupid, when it comes down to describing the biggest problem in healthcare today. And I care about value-based care because it essentially represents all these different approaches to switch the predominant form of reimbursement in the country from a fee-for-service, which is kind of like an a la carte, going to order different sides and dishes off the menu at a restaurant, to tie services for the actual care you receive. And I think that a successful implementation of that would represent basically a huge turning point.
It's an interesting point, right? You bring up the a la carte thing, and I know right away people hear that and they're probably thinking, okay, so I could tell you, I personally, at least back, when people actually went out for dinner, before the pandemic, they'd have this restaurant week, right? Here in Boston, and I know a lot of other cities have restaurant week or whatever, where a bunch of area restaurants, they'll have a special price fixed menu, right? And it's got the salad, appetizer, entree, and dessert. And you could pick from, 3 options in each of those categories. And it was one flat rate, and that was it. And you paid that fee and you pick off that menu. And I was always the guy, be there with my wife and, a group of friends, and we're all out to dinner and we're going, and everyone's ordering off this price fixed menu because that's why you're there for restaurant week, to order off their special menu. I'm always the guy who would ask for the standard menu, and I would start picking things a la carte because I never like what they put on the price fixed menu, right? I don't like it when other people tell me what to do. So, somebody hears that and says, what's wrong with that? What's the downside of paying for the services that I need?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I think a good way of explaining it, and kind of adding on to the menu metaphor, is now imagine the menu is basically the catch of the day menu where there's no price listed, or a fancy wine menu where there's no price listed. So you really don't know what you're going to get until the bill comes. And that is really one of the biggest problems. It's a tale as old as time that the majority of modern healthcare history, hospitals haven't really listed prices. And even if they did, which they're starting to do with charge masters and other state reforms that are often kind of making them start listing prices, but it doesn't actually reflect what insurers are paying and even sometimes what the actual patient is paying. So it can vary wildly. They're not necessarily even tied to reality. Like I remember hearing a story about a guy in Connecticut that took his 3-year-old to the ER. She hit her head on like the slide. And of course, like every parent, the first time their child starts bleeding a ton, they're going to freak out. So they took their kid to the ER and they got charged $20 for a single Band-Aid. And the reporter that was looking into the story like found out that instead of actually like tying it to the real price of Band-Aids, they just literally looked at the price of Band-Aids in 1950 and adjusted for inflation or something crazy like that. And there's no actual basis in reality for a lot of these prices. And then the even bigger problem with this whole menu of healthcare is fee for service. That is the technical term for it. The bigger problem with the fee for service approach is that it creates all these like perverse incentives for unnecessary care and overcharging fees. And either there's no transparency behind it, or even if there is transparency, the ground level consumer, me, you, the patient, don't know what those charges mean. It leads to all these downstream consequences like the specialist problem, where there's a shortage of primary care physicians because they can't make enough money to pay their student loans back. That's essentially why fee for service has to go. And both the private and public sectors have really, really been pushing for this squishy concept of value-based care that no one can really seem to agree on exactly what it is, like you touched on. Like another term for it is alternative payer models. And you'll see all these different terms out there in the wild. But it generally refers to kind of supply side payment models that are meant to change how physicians, hospitals, provider organizations are reimbursed to cut off those perverse incentives and to address those and to actually get the providers on board with lowering costs.
It's funny because when you're comparing this to the menu model and you keep using the word perverse, which is kind of funny because I suddenly have this image of me, like I said, out to dinner with my family and friends. I've got this image where looking at the menu and like you said, the prices are not listed, but now I'm taking it one step further where, the maitre d' or the server or the chef is coming out of the kitchen and they're saying, you're going to eat 3 lobsters. You're going to eat 4 escargot, and you're going to have this bottle of champagne. So the one who is being compensated for the goods is also the one dictating which goods are being purchased, which is really, if you think about it from just an economic standpoint, if you kind of step back, capitalism, microeconomics work because the consumer, A, is the one who's paying the cost, right? So I have a certain amount of funds with which I can purchase goods. So I know what my budget is. It's my money. I'm paying for it. And I also have the ability to compare, which options are available to me and what the cost of those options are. And so I can make an educated decision. And things like competition and things like that, they kind of come into it because that's what drives the prices down and sort of helps me because I have this ability to pick and choose. And because I have this ability to shop around and do this price compare, and because I have a budget within which I need to stick, the providers of goods, they need to compete to get my limited funds, my limited business, and attract me as a consumer. And because in the current model, which you're sort of railing against, A, the consumer, even though they're paying, they don't realize they're paying because, of course, they're focused on the copay, they're focused on the deductible. They're not thinking about how if they consume excessive goods, in this case, healthcare, and they don't care about the price of those goods, eventually it comes back to bite them in the form of higher premiums or contributions if they're self-funded. But because of that delay between the time from when you consume it and when you pay for it, people don't really see how their actions today impact what they're paying for their insurance or their plan tomorrow, which is really interesting because with auto insurance, you get a little fender bender. Everybody is quick to say, let's not tell the insurance. I'll just take care of it myself. Because there, they definitely see how the accident's going to impact their premiums downstream. But here, we're all quick to whip out the insurance card. So anyway, one, they, feel like they're not the ones paying. And 2, you don't know what the price is. So how can you be competitive and how can you compare? And then 3, like I said, the provider that's actually telling you is the one who's also providing the good. I wonder if it would be different if, for instance, you had one provider who tells you what you need and then a completely different provider who provides the good and is compensated. You may see less of a sort of perverse incentive to overtreat, which is what you were talking about, overtreating. One of the other things I often see about sort of the fee-for-service model is that, our hope is that providers are first and foremost trying to keep us healthy and well. But what's really interesting, I'm a type 1 diabetic. I don't know if you know that, Mike. I've been taking insulin since I was 9 years old. And I remember, I had a friend who was convinced that they could have cured diabetes years ago. But because I'm constantly paying for insulin, it wouldn't benefit them to give me a cure because I'm a customer for life as long as I'm sick. And, I'm not saying I believe that, obviously, but it's kind of interesting where it benefits these providers for you to be sick and seeking care if they're being compensated on a fee-for-service model. Whereas if they were being compensated for, let's say, the amount of time between visits or, compensated for keeping you well versus for these individual treatments when you're unwell, technically the financial incentive would align with what our ultimate goal is, which is to be healthy and well. Is that at all sort of hitting on the mark that you're mentioning?
I completely agree with everything you said. I mean, at this point, we've just created the worst restaurant imaginable. And that's essentially U.S. healthcare right now. It's slowly but surely improving, but again, the service is awful and you have no choice in what you're eating. I think what you said about having like one provider diagnose it and then another provider actually provide the service is kind of an interesting concept. And I think that's actually pretty close to some value-based care models like ACOs and integrated care models that involve one PCP who is actually kind of doing the main groundwork when it comes to labs, diagnosis. They're almost like a case manager for that patient, right? And then they actually kind of sculpt along with the patient like a care plan and then they might refer it out to a specialist to carry out the specific duty. And the interesting thing about that is it reduces some of the unnecessary care that a specialist might otherwise recommend or perform, especially, we're assuming like just purely based on their economic incentives. Of course, there's good specialists out there who are ethical and don't want to cause people like unnecessary surgeries and costs. But generally speaking, if someone just chooses a specialist off the internet and goes there, there's not necessarily a limitation in how much unnecessary care they're going to get. Like there's been study after study showing that surgeons will so readily recommend a drastic surgery, especially for things like knee replacements, rather than maybe like doing some physical therapy or something that's less invasive, which also equals less expensive, right? And I think the other interesting thing that you mentioned is how there's this unseen, almost like moral hazard of not bearing like the direct cost of healthcare itself for patients, right? So if I'm Joe Schmo going to the doctor with my generous employer plan that FIA so bestows on me, I don't necessarily see the upfront cost of the ER bill. But over the long term, I'm definitely going to end up absorbing those costs. Like one thing that we always talk about in this country is how taxes are lower compared to other developed countries. Yet if you were to like take the taxes that say someone in Chile or the Netherlands pays for that go to healthcare, it probably looks lower than the average person's like healthcare expenditures. And a big reason for that is basically fee for service continues to slowly grow every year faster than inflation. And you can pretty much see a direct like skyrocketing line of both employer premiums and the actual price of healthcare going up. In fact, premiums rose faster than wages over the last 10 years, which is almost exactly the same rate that inpatient hospital prices grew for employer-based plans.
Mike, it's interesting when you bring up taxes and how in other nations where more or less the government's paying for your health care and then they're using money that they collected in the form of taxes to do so. In the United States, I feel, and maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, that most people view their health insurance premiums in essence like a tax. They think, hey, this is what it costs and I can't do anything to control it. The same way when they decide to increase or change my real estate tax. I get a statement from the town, I have to cut a check or go online, I have to pay the city in which I live for my real estate tax, and I have to pay the state. And these are the taxes. I don't dictate or control what percent or what amount I need to pay them. I just pay what the law tells me to pay because it's a tax. What's interesting, and one of the sad things I think, is that in the United States, where at least to date, we still maintain some private essence, not gonna say it's purely private, but the cost of health insurance or these health plans are still private entities for all intents and purposes, is that there are things you can do to control those costs. Whereas if it was a tax, you couldn't control it. And the fact that people have kind of given up and thrown their hands in the air and said, it is what it is, and I can't control what these premiums are going to be. I can't control what these contributions are going to be, and thereby treating it like a tax, you've basically given up, and you might as well be in one of those countries where it is sort of a Medicare for all model or something like that. So, again, if we end up there, it's no one else's fault but our own, and I don't really see that it'll be all that different from where we are right now. However, I do think the opportunity exists to take advantage of the private nature of healthcare today and take steps to actually reduce those costs and have a material impact on what health insurance or health plans cost. And ultimately, like you said, it comes down to the actual price of the care and how you're paying for it and what you're paying for. And, looking really quickly, and it behooves me before this podcast comes to an end to talk about, one of our own experiences with a value-based care model and primary care in particular, and that's our use of direct primary care. We're big proponents of direct primary care. We have partnerships with multiple direct primary care offices and teams around the country, with our own employees who are scattered around the country. It was important to us that it be available to everyone who's on our plan, not just those of us who are based out of Massachusetts in our headquarters. But I've been a patient of a direct primary care physician, Dr. Tremblay, whom we have a relationship here in Massachusetts for many, many years. And the level of service that I've gotten from him is outstanding. And, he's being paid a subscription fee. He's being paid a capitated fee. And he isn't incentivized to treat me unnecessarily so that he can bill for it. Instead, he's incentivized to keep me as healthy as possible so that he can spend his time and his resources on the people who actually need it. And as a result, if something can be done virtually by phone or by text, he can do it. And at the same time, when there's an opportunity, he has me come in and he'll spend hours, not minutes, but hours with me, because he wants to make sure that when I leave, he's not going to see me for at least another year, because I'm going to be healthy and well, because we discussed everything and caught everything at the time. He's more efficient, more effective with his time as well as the way he communicates and deals with me. So, just looking at sort of a micro example of value-based care and direct primary care in a physician, it's definitely worked for me. He's done well, I'm doing well, everyone's doing well using that model. The one thing I will say, and it's kind of sad, because every time a value-based care concept or model, and there's many different types, and we can't go into all the details today, but it seems so common sense. That's what's killing me, is that so much of this is based on common sense. Something happens and somebody points at it and goes, well, this is why we can't do it. And COVID-19 has been a pain for so many reasons, but this is just one more reason. You do have some providers that embraced the ACO model, right? They embraced the value-based care model, and they weren't charging a fee for service. And unfortunately, early in the pandemic, there really wasn't much you could do to keep your patients healthy, because we didn't understand the disease. We didn't know what we could do. We didn't know how to treat it. And unfortunately, you had some of these hospitals that were getting a capitated subscription fee, right? And they had a bunch of patients coming in with COVID. And so these patients, like you've heard, they were inpatient, they required substantial resources, round-the-clock care. They were spending days or weeks or months in the hospital on respirators. And so this hospital, which has already been paid in the form of a subscription fee, they cannot charge for those services. Whereas a hospital that did not embrace a value-based care methodology and did not embrace ACO model, they're charging millions of dollars because they had some guy in a bed for a couple of weeks. The pandemic, in a lot of ways, rewarded the providers who opposed value-based care and punished those who embraced it. So I don't think that is necessarily something that long-term, but short-term, I don't like seeing that some providers who embrace what I think makes sense for everybody were punished, at least in part, by this pandemic. So that's just sort of an unfortunate fallout from the pandemic, and hopefully it doesn't send us back too far in our push to get these alternative methodologies in place with providers. But that's some of the negative. I guess what I'd like to do is let you see us out. You get the final word on some of the things, some of the trends that you've noticed with providers where value-based care is benefiting them, and maybe give us some hope for the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's always positive to end on a good note, and I agree with what you're saying. I have actually also used the DPC care at FIA, even though I'm still only 6 months new to the FIA team, but I love the experience, and I gotta say, you're right. It's great that my doctor doesn't necessarily want to talk to me every day. It's just better to get it over and done with. As far as some of the positive sides, I think that we're seeing with value-based care is when it comes to actual kind of payment reforms, is slowly but surely there has been a steady increase in the amount of healthcare dollars that are switching from a fee-for-service model to some form of value-based care, whether that's bundled payments, DPC, or other capitated models like you mentioned with DPC, where it's like they get a set fee and the money that they get to keep is the savings. So there does seem to be hope that providers aren't necessarily against that type of payment model. I think one of the big challenges, especially in the private sector, is we don't have the market power that Medicare does as employer-based plans. I mean, Medicare is the largest insurer in the country, so they can easily counteract these large hospital systems that are gobbling up smaller providers and physician groups and jacking up their prices. Instead, we have to rely on very creative solutions, two really positive things. One, direct provider care, which, like you said, COVID isn't necessarily helpful for these models, but these models are built for the long haul, not necessarily pandemic emergencies. Right. So when it comes to DPC with an urgent care or a full hospital, might be more difficult considering the type of emergent conditions that they often see. But something like bundled payments in terms of the actual pay side of reform if you can navigate the complexities of a network contract, which you don't necessarily need as a plan, but they are very helpful if you want to help protect your participants from balance billing. But the problem with a lot of those contracts is they are very aggressive about preventing other provider networks on top of theirs or taking away their business. So something like bundle payments may be a hurdle to overcome when it comes to network contracts, but the rewards have shown to be very promising. Like there was an employer out of California that saw costs and based purely on measuring from like the actual date of an operation to 30 days out. They saw costs for knee surgeries, lap band surgeries, and there's one other condition that I can't remember from that particular experiment, but they saw 10 to 15% price reductions for the claims that they were paying. So long term, it is showing to be effective. And those savings can also help plans afford costs for emergencies like COVID that pop up. So these kind of like slow and steady solutions can also help prepare for a rainy day. Outside of the payment side, which is something that employer plans definitely have their hands binded a lot more, and is one of those things that, like you said, just like it seems so simple, why can't we just do it? Well, the area where it can be a lot more simple is actually addressing the participant incentives. Your own plan population's desires to get certain care or wants to get unnecessary care can be shifted through a lot of education and cost incentives. Like our plan, I think, has a couple like ingenious solutions, like waiving urgent care costs if a participant goes to urgent care over the ER, or cost waiving copays for generic medications when it's an alternative for preferred or specialty brand medications, which often does not lead to any drop in the actual quality of healthcare that you're getting. Generic medications, especially for things like insulin, have been on the market for a long time. I mean, you tell me, is there a difference between generic insulin and who is it, Eli Lilly, or like any good name? Yeah, exactly.
No difference.
And my mother-in-law has arthritis and has to take Advil. It's like the second most expensive medication that you can buy right now. And even though she's getting Medicare eligible, the only way she can afford the actual medication is she has to participate in this patient assistance program, which those have all sorts of controversy around them too. But it just shows the heartbreaking side of monopolies and the expensive nature of healthcare, but bringing it back to what employers can do in terms of educating their participants and shifting cost incentives to reflect higher value services and lower value services. The urgent care is a great example of that. And there's actually basically blueprints for plans to allow participants to enjoy benefits of like high value services like cancer screenings, even though those are covered partially by the preventative mandate, but other things like LDL testing, cholesterol testing can have a very high benefit for most of us, right? I come from a family where I'm at a high risk of heart disease because of high blood pressure and cholesterol. So having regular LDL tests is something that's very beneficial for me. So if I can have lower cost sharing for that, I would love that. But at the same time, having outpatient labs taken at every time I go to my primary care physician is needless. So we can increase the price on that. It's aligning your cost sharing to services that have been shown to be clinically effective is a major thing that I think is underutilized in employer plans today, and that can really help take the benefits of ERISA to another level in terms of looking at the actual value of services as opposed to accepting the way things are.
So I think that, the moral of the story is that there are things you can do now, regardless of the model with which your provider wants to align. And I would say that you mentioned before the FIA group is doing a lot of those things with our own plan. Obviously, I welcome anybody to reach out, contact us, find out more about what we're doing with our plan, and we'll be happy to share. But I think that brings to an end our time for this particular episode. Micah, I really appreciate it. Good conversation. And I look forward to dealing with this issue in particular with you and our clients in the near future.
Yeah, thanks for having Brady. I mean, me.
Yeah. Keep dreaming or nightmares. Thanks, everyone. Be well, stay well, and be sure to join us again for the next episode of Empowering Plans with the Fusion. Thanks so much.